I have watched the relationship between the United States and Canada for most of my professional life, and I can say this without exaggeration. What happened today is not normal. It is not routine. And it is not something that happens between countries that like to describe each other as closest allies. Canada has ordered the expulsion of a sitting U.S. ambassador. That single sentence should stop you in your tracks. Between adversaries, ambassador expulsions happen. Between fragile states, they happen. Between rivals testing each other's limits, they are almost expected. But between Washington and Ottawa, two governments that pride themselves on quiet coordination, institutional trust, and the ability to manage disagreements behind closed doors, this is a shock to the system. There was no gentle recall, no carefully worded consultations, no diplomatic choreography designed to save face on both sides. Instead, Canada invoked the most severe tool available under international diplomatic law, and did so openly, deliberately, and without apology. That choice matters. When a country expels an ambassador, it is not simply expressing anger. It is declaring that the normal rules of engagement have broken down. It is saying that private warnings failed, that back channels collapsed, and that continued tolerance would carry greater risks than public rupture. In short, it is the moment when a government decides that stability has already been lost and that pretending otherwise is no longer sustainable. What makes this moment especially unsettling is not just the action itself, but the relationship in which it occurred. The United States and Canada share the world's longest undefended border. They coordinate intelligence, defense, trade, and infrastructure with a level of intimacy that few other nations even attempt. Their economies are so intertwined that a single manufactured product can cross the border multiple times before it reaches a consumer. This is not a relationship built for drama, it is built for predictability. So when Canada decides to expel a US ambassador, the question is not whether this is serious. The question is what had to go wrong quietly, repeatedly, and persistently for Ottawa to conclude that this was the least damaging option left on the table. Because moves like this do not come from impulse. They come from calculation. And once they are made, they tend to reshape relationships in ways that are far harder to reverse than anyone wants to admit. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand how the United States and Canada normally handle conflict. This is not a relationship built on public confrontation. It is built on habit, process, and an almost reflexive commitment to keeping disagreements out of view. For decades, Washington and Ottawa have argued constantly over lumber, dairy, steel, energy, pipelines, environmental rules, border security, and defense spending. None of this is new. What is unusual is not disagreement, but how disagreement is expressed. Traditionally, disputes are managed quietly through bureaucratic channels, joint commissions, ministerial calls, and carefully staged negotiations that allow both sides to claim progress without humiliation. That quiet management is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign of interdependence. The United States and Canada do not merely trade with each other. They function as a single, integrated system across multiple sectors. Supply chains in automotive manufacturing, aerospace, energy, agriculture, and defense are deeply intertwined. Intelligence sharing operates on the assumption of trust. Military coordination through NORAD relies on constant information flow and political reliability. Even border enforcement is structured around cooperation rather than confrontation. This level of integration creates a powerful incentive to de-escalate. When something goes wrong, both sides usually work harder to contain it, not publicize it. Ambassadors, in particular, are expected to act as shock absorbers to smooth tensions, not amplify them. That is why Canada's decision to expel a US ambassador is so extraordinary. It signals that the normal tools failed. It suggests that quiet warnings did not correct behavior, that institutional channels were exhausted, and that Ottawa concluded the costs of inaction had begun to outweigh the costs of rupture. Historically, Canada reserves ambassador expulsions for the most serious circumstances, espionage cases, national security threats, or clear violations of sovereignty. Political disagreement alone has never been enough. Even during periods of intense friction, Canadian governments have shown a strong preference for restraint, precisely because escalation threatens systems that cannot be easily disentangled. That preference did not disappear overnight, which makes the question unavoidable. What changed? What behavior crossed a threshold that Canada has spent generations refusing to cross itself? And why did Ottawa decide that preserving diplomatic norms now required breaking one in the most public way possible? The answers to those questions lie not in today's headlines, but in the warnings that came before and were ignored. What happened today did not begin today. It began quietly, in ways the public almost never sees, and in places that are designed specifically to prevent moments like this from ever reaching daylight. According to officials familiar with the process, the first signs of strain emerged months ago, when Canadian diplomats raised concerns through routine channels about the conduct of the U.S. ambassador. At that stage, the issues were framed cautiously as matters of tone, protocol, and boundaries. No threats, no ultimatums. Just a clear expectation that established diplomatic norms would be respected. Those early warnings were private by design. That is how these systems are supposed to work. Diplomacy relies on correction before confrontation, on giving counterparts room to adjust without forcing either side into a public corner. For a while, Ottawa appeared to believe that was still possible, but the pattern did not stop. By late autumn, Canadian officials describe a shift from isolated incidents to what they viewed as repeated violations. Public commentary on domestic Canadian politics became more frequent. Meetings that would normally remain within diplomatic lanes reportedly expanded to include figures outside the governing structure. Messaging that Canadian officials believed blurred the line between representation and pressure continued despite explicit objections. At that point, the tone changed. What had begun as informal concern escalated into formal notice. According to multiple diplomatic sources, Canada communicated directly that the behavior in question was unacceptable and inconsistent with the obligations of a foreign envoy. The expectation was straightforward: a just course or consequences would follow. Washington, however, appeared to misread the moment. Rather than recalibrating, the ambassador's public and private engagement reportedly continued along the same trajectory. From Ottawa's perspective, this created a dangerous precedent. If repeated warnings produced no meaningful change, tolerance itself risked becoming complicity. The issue was no longer one of irritation, but of institutional integrity. By early winter, Canadian intelligence and legal officials were reportedly asked to review the situation. Their assessment, briefed to senior levels of government, focused less on intent and more on pattern. Under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, host countries are not required to prove criminal misconduct. They are required only to determine whether a diplomat's presence remains acceptable. That distinction matters. From Canada's point of view, the accumulation of incidents suggested escalation, not misunderstanding. More importantly, it suggested that further private handling would only normalize behavior. Ottawa believed violated both the spirit and the letter of diplomatic law. Still, expulsion remained a last resort. Even then, officials hesitated. The economic stakes were immense, the political fallout was predictable, and the bilateral relationship was too valuable to damage lightly. But restraint has limits. When warnings are ignored repeatedly, they lose their deterrent effect. When norms are challenged openly and without consequence, institutions either enforce their boundaries or surrender them. By the time the final decision was made, Canadian officials were no longer debating whether the situation could be repaired quietly. They were debating whether failing to act would signal that the rules no longer mattered at all. When Canada finally acted, it did so with precision rather than theatrics. There was no dramatic countdown, no staged confrontation, no attempt to extract last-minute concessions. Instead, Ottawa reached for one of the clearest and most consequential tools available in diplomatic law: the declaration of persona non grata. That phrase carries a specific meaning, and it is often misunderstood. Declaring a diplomat persona non grata is not an accusation of a crime. It does not require proof of espionage, corruption, or hostile intent. Under international diplomatic conventions, a host country is not obligated to justify the decision at all. It need only determine that the continued presence of a foreign envoy is no longer acceptable. That legal simplicity is precisely what makes the tool so powerful and so rarely used. For Canada, invoking persona non grata was not about punishment. It was about boundaries. It signaled that private correction had failed, that institutional norms had been tested and found wanting, and that further tolerance would undermine the very framework that allows diplomacy to function. Timing mattered as much as substance. The ambassador was summoned without advance publicity. The message was delivered directly, formally, and without negotiation. A fixed deadline was set, and crucially, there was no ambiguity about reversal. Once the declaration was made, the decision became final by design. That is how the mechanism works. It is meant to close a chapter, not reopen it. Equally telling was what Canada did next. Within minutes, confirmation of the expulsion reached major media outlets. This was not a leak in the traditional sense. It was controlled disclosure. Ottawa wanted the sequence to be public, documented, and difficult to reinterpret. By moving quickly, Canadian officials ensured that the narrative would center on process and legality rather than speculation or retaliation. This approach served several purposes at once. Domestically, it demonstrated that the government was enforcing clear rules rather than reacting emotionally. Internationally, it framed the decision as a rules-based action rather than a political provocation. And diplomatically, it placed the burden of escalation squarely on Washington's side of the table. Notably absent from Canada's public statements was inflammatory language. There were no personal attacks, no ideological framing, no suggestion that the relationship itself was being abandoned. The emphasis remained narrow. Conduct, norms, obligations. That restraint was deliberate. By grounding the decision in established diplomatic practice, Canada limited the range of credible responses available to the United States. Retaliation would no longer be framed as a dispute over facts, but as a choice to escalate beyond a legally defensible action. Silence, on the other hand, would carry its own implications. This is the paradox of persona non grata. It is both decisive and stabilizing. It resolves an immediate problem while forcing all parties to confront a new reality. The old equilibrium has already broken. From that point forward, the question was no longer whether a crisis existed. It was how far its consequences would travel and who would bear the cost of pretending it could be contained. The effects of a diplomatic rupture like this do not unfold gradually. They move fast, often in ways that never make headlines, but are felt almost immediately by the systems that depend on predictability. The first reaction comes from markets. Not because traders care deeply about protocol, but because they care about risk. When two of the world's most integrated economies signal instability, even briefly, uncertainty gets priced in. Currency markets respond. Bond yields adjust. Companies with heavy cross-border exposure see pressure before official policy has time to change. That reaction is not irrational, it is structural. More than $2.5 billion in goods cross the U.S.-Canada border every single day. Automotive parts, energy products, agricultural goods, industrial components, all of them move through systems designed for speed, not friction. Even minor diplomatic tension can introduce hesitation into coordination processes that normally operate on trust and routine. The most sensitive areas feel it first. Border agencies rely on constant communication. Intelligence and security coordination depends on informal relationships as much as formal agreements. When trust becomes uncertain, procedures slow, extra checks appear, meetings get postponed. None of this requires an official announcement. It happens quietly, as institutions protect themselves from risk. For companies operating on just-in-time logistics, those delays compound quickly. Manufacturers do not keep weeks of inventory for critical components. They depend on timing measured in hours. A short disruption at key crossings, Detroit, Windsor, Buffalo, Fort Erie, Blaine, Surrey, can ripple through entire supply chains within days. Markets understand this instinctively. That is why even the perception of instability matters. Investors do not wait for retaliation to begin. They adjust to the possibility of it. Politically, the immediate effects are more subtle but no less real. In Ottawa, the government gains temporary leverage by appearing decisive and disciplined. In Washington, the response options narrow quickly. Escalation risks harming domestic constituencies that depend on cross-border trade. Inaction risks signaling weakness. That tension plays out behind closed doors long before it reaches campaign messaging. What is striking is how little drama is required for damage to begin. No tariffs need to be imposed, no agreements need to be canceled. The mere interruption of diplomatic normalcy is enough to force recalculation across institutions built on assumption and habit. And those recalculations are difficult to reverse. Once officials begin operating defensively, once companies start building contingencies, once markets adjust expectations, stability does not simply snap back when rhetoric cools. Systems remember disruption even after leaders move on. That is the hidden cost of moments like this. The expulsion itself is finite. The shock waves it sends through economic, bureaucratic, and political systems are not. They continue quietly, reshaping behavior long after the headlines fade. Which is why the most important question is not how either government responds publicly, but how both sides adapt privately to a relationship that suddenly feels less reliable than it did before. At first glance, it might seem obvious who holds the upper hand in a confrontation like this. The United States is larger, more powerful, and far less economically dependent on Canada than Canada is on the United States. That assumption is deeply ingrained in Washington, and it is precisely why this episode cuts more sharply on the American side than many initially expect. Power in modern diplomacy is not measured solely by size. It is measured by leverage, credibility, and the ability to predict outcomes. In this case, Canada acted in a way that was legally defensible, procedurally disciplined, and strategically narrow. Washington, by contrast, now faces a set of options that are all costly in different ways. Retaliation is the most obvious response. But retaliation is rarely clean when the relationship is this integrated. Expelling a Canadian ambassador, tightening border procedures, or signaling trade consequences may satisfy a political impulse, but each carries domestic fallout. Manufacturing states, agricultural exporters, energy markets, and logistics hubs are all exposed to even modest friction. The pain would not remain abstract. It would show up quickly and unevenly, often in places politically sensitive to the very administration considering escalation. Doing nothing, however, carries its own risks. Silence can be interpreted as acquiescence. A muted response invites questions about internal control and diplomatic discipline. It also sets a precedent. If a close ally enforces boundaries publicly and faces no meaningful pushback, other governments may conclude that similar action is both possible and effective. This is the strategic bind. Canada's move was structured to minimize its own exposure while maximizing Washington's dilemma. By grounding the decision in international law rather than political rhetoric, Ottawa reduced the space for counter-narratives. The issue is no longer whether Canada was offended. The issue is whether the United States accepts the rules it expects others to follow. That distinction matters far beyond this bilateral dispute. Washington's diplomatic influence has long rested on an assumption of institutional reliability. Allies may disagree with American policy, but they generally trust the underlying framework. When that trust is tested, responses become less deferential and more defensive. Canada's decision reflects that shift. It signals that economic dependence no longer guarantees diplomatic tolerance. There is also a temporal imbalance at work. Canada can afford to absorb short-term disruption to protect long-term norms. Washington, operating under electoral pressure and rapid media cycles, faces incentives that favor immediate response over strategic patience. That asymmetry magnifies the cost of miscalculation. In practical terms, this means Washington must now weigh every move more carefully than Ottawa does. Any escalation risks reinforcing the very behavior Canada claims it is responding to. Any retreat risks encouraging similar challenges elsewhere. This is not a contest. Canada is trying to win publicly. It is one it is trying to survive institutionally. And in that sense, the expulsion functions less as a provocation than as a constraint, one that forces the United States to confront a question it rarely has to answer directly. What happens when an ally decides that predictability matters more than appeasement? What makes this episode particularly consequential is not the bilateral dispute itself, but the precedent it sets. Canada is not just another country reacting to Washington. It is one of America's most trusted allies, deeply embedded in U.S. security, trade, and intelligence frameworks. When a government like that decides to enforce boundaries publicly, others take notice. Allies watch each other closely, especially in moments of stress. They look for signals about what is tolerated, what is enforceable, and what happens when long-standing assumptions no longer hold. Canada's decision sends a quiet but unmistakable message. Economic integration does not nullify sovereignty, and alliance does not require unlimited patience. That message resonates far beyond North America. In Europe, governments already navigating tensions over trade, defense spending, and industrial policy will study this case carefully. In Asia, partners balancing security cooperation with concerns about political unpredictability will do the same. The lesson is not that confrontation is desirable, but that restraint has limits, and that those limits can be asserted without abandoning international norms. This is how precedents form in modern diplomacy, not through dramatic breaks or formal declarations, but through a series of disciplined actions that redefine expectations. Once one ally demonstrates that a particular response is viable, others gain both confidence and cover to consider similar options if circumstances demand it. From Washington's perspective, this is an uncomfortable development. American influence has historically benefited from the assumption that allies will absorb friction quietly for the sake of stability. When that assumption weakens, coordination becomes more conditional. Consultation replaces compliance, and deference gives way to negotiation. Importantly, this shift does not require open hostility. It operates through risk management. Governments begin to diversify partnerships. They build redundancy into supply chains. They hedge diplomatically. None of these steps are confrontational on their own, but together they reduce reliance on any single actor. Canada's action fits squarely into that pattern. It does not signal a rejection of the alliance. It signals a recalibration of expectations. The relationship continues, but under clearer rules and with firmer boundaries. That distinction matters because it suggests a future defined less by automatic alignment and more by conditional cooperation. For allies watching from the sidelines, the takeaway is subtle but powerful. Stability is no longer guaranteed by proximity or history alone. It must be maintained actively and defended when necessary. Canada's decision illustrates how that defense can take shape without tearing the system apart. The broader question now is not whether others will imitate this exact move, but whether they will internalize its logic. If they do, the architecture of American alliances may look increasingly similar to the one Canada is signaling today, still connected, still cooperative, but far less willing to rely on trust alone. It would be easy to reduce this moment to a single dramatic act, the expulsion of an ambassador, and treat it as an anomaly. But doing so would miss what actually makes it significant. This was not about one individual. It was about the limits of tolerance in a relationship that has long depended on assumption rather than enforcement. Canada did not act because it wanted confrontation. It acted because the tools designed to prevent confrontation no longer worked. That distinction matters. For decades, the US-Canada relationship functioned on the belief that stability could absorb almost any strain. Disagreements were managed quietly. Norms were assumed rather than tested. Trust filled the gaps where rules were vague. This episode suggests that those assumptions are no longer sufficient on their own. What replaced them was not hostility, but formality. Canada turned to law, to procedure, to boundaries that do not require shared sentiment, only shared rules. In doing so, it signaled a broader shift that extends beyond this case. Alliances today are being redefined less by goodwill and more by reliability. That is a subtle but profound change. Predictability has become a form of power. When it erodes, even close partners begin to protect themselves, not loudly, not dramatically, but methodically. They recalibrate expectations, they build safeguards, and when necessary, they enforce lines that once existed only implicitly. None of this means the relationship between Washington and Ottawa is broken, but it does mean it has changed. And changes like this tend to linger long after the immediate crisis fades from view. The question moving forward is not whether relations will return to normal. It is whether normal itself has been redefined. In a world where trust must increasingly be earned rather than assumed, moments like this are less about rupture than revelation. They show us where the system's fault lines truly lie and how quietly and decisively they can be enforced when they are crossed.